economy shaped our world more than war? What if the wealth of entire nations, the layout of our cities, and even the food on your table can be traced back to one horrific period that lasted over 400 years? Today, we're diving deep into the transatlantic slave trade, a story that connects 3 continents and millions of lives across centuries. This isn't just history. This is the foundation of the world we live in today. By the end of this video, you'll understand how this tragic period created the economic systems, racial divisions, and global inequalities that still define our society. You'll see how the echoes of the past continue to shape everything from wealth distribution to cultural movements happening right now. So, buckle up, because we're about to uncover the most important story never fully told. Let me start with a number that will shock you. Over 12.5 million Africans were forced onto ships and transported across the Atlantic Ocean between 1525 and 1866. But here's what's even more devastating. For every person who survived the journey, at least 2 more died before they even reached the ships. We're talking about over 50 million lives destroyed. To put this in perspective, imagine the entire population of South Korea just vanishing. That's the scale we're dealing with. But the transatlantic slave trade didn't start overnight. It began in the 1440s, when Portuguese explorers first reached the west coast of Africa. Initially, they weren't looking for slaves. They wanted gold, spices, and other luxury goods. But they quickly realized that human beings could be the most profitable cargo of all. The Spanish were next, followed by the Dutch, French, and British. Each nation wanted their piece of what would become the most profitable business in human history. Now, let's talk about how this system actually worked. Picture a triangle connecting 3 continents. Ships would leave Europe loaded with manufactured goods, guns, textiles, rum, and metal tools. These goods were traded in Africa for enslaved people. The ships would then make the horrific journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage. In the Americas, enslaved people were sold, and the ships were loaded with sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other raw materials. Finally, these products were shipped back to Europe to be processed and sold. Each leg of this triangle generated massive profits, but the human cost was unimaginable. Let me paint you a picture of what the Middle Passage was really like. Imagine being chained in a space so small you can't even sit up straight. The ceiling is about 4 feet high. You're lying next to hundreds of other people in the same position. The air is thick with the smell of human waste, vomit, and death. You haven't seen sunlight in weeks. You don't know where you're going or if you'll ever see your family again. Many people chose to jump overboard rather than endure another day. Ship captains actually budgeted for losing about 15% of their cargo during each voyage. They treated human beings like they were shipping furniture. The psychological trauma was just as devastating as the physical suffering. Families were torn apart forever. Children were separated from their parents. Husbands and wives were sold to different plantations, thousands of miles apart. Entire communities that had existed for generations were destroyed in a matter of days. But here's something that might surprise you. Africa wasn't just a victim in this story. Some African rulers and merchants became extremely wealthy by participating in the slave trade. They would capture people from rival tribes or sell criminals and prisoners of war. This created a cycle of violence and warfare that lasted for centuries. The demand for enslaved people led to constant conflict between African communities. Some historians argue that this internal warfare set back African development by hundreds of years. Now let's talk about what happened when these ships reached the Americas. The enslaved people were sold at markets like livestock. Families were separated again as buyers chose who they wanted. People were examined, prodded, and treated as property. The buyers were looking for strong workers who could survive the brutal conditions on plantations. Most enslaved people ended up working on sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil. Sugar was like the oil of the 16th and 17th centuries. Everyone wanted it, and it was incredibly profitable. But growing and processing sugar was back-breaking work. People worked 6-hour days in extreme heat. The death rate on sugar plantations was so high that plantation owners constantly needed new workers. This is why the slave trade continued for so long. In North America, enslaved people were forced to grow tobacco, rice, and later cotton. When the cotton gin was invented in 1793, it made cotton production much more profitable. This actually increased the demand for enslaved labor, just as some people were starting to question whether slavery was morally wrong. By 1860, there were almost 4 million enslaved people in the United States. The entire Southern economy was built on their unpaid labor, but the economic impact went far beyond individual plantations. The profits from slave labor built some of the biggest banks, insurance companies, and shipping firms in the world. Many of these companies still exist today. Wall Street itself was built on money that came from the slave trade. The New York Stock Exchange was originally a place where people bought and sold enslaved human beings. Insurance companies made money by insuring enslaved people as property. Banks made loans using enslaved people as collateral. Even in northern cities that didn't allow slavery, the economy was deeply connected to slave labor. Textile mills in Massachusetts processed cotton picked by enslaved people. Rum distilleries in Rhode Island used sugar grown by enslaved people. Shipbuilders in Maine constructed vessels specifically designed for the slave trade. The wealth generated by this system didn't just disappear when slavery ended. It was passed down through generations of white families while black families had nothing. This created a wealth gap that still exists today. Think about it this way. If your great-great-grandfather owned a plantation, your family probably inherited land, money, and social connections. If your great-great-grandfather was enslaved, your family started with nothing and faced decades of legal discrimination. This helps explain why the average white family today has about 10 times more wealth than the average black family. It's not ancient history. It's a direct line from the past to the present. The slave trade also shaped the racial ideas that still influence our society. Before the transatlantic slave trade, people didn't think about race the way we do today. But enslaving millions of people required a justification. So European and American societies developed the idea that black people were somehow less human. They created fake scientific theories to support this belief. They used religion to argue that slavery was God's plan. These racist ideas became deeply embedded in laws, institutions, and culture. Even after slavery ended, these beliefs continued to shape how society treated black people. The slave trade also had a massive impact on Africa that continues today. The constant warfare and population loss prevented African societies from developing economically. European colonizers later used Africa's apparent backwardness to justify taking over the continent. They conveniently ignored the fact that they had caused much of this instability through the slave trade. When African countries finally gained independence in the 20th century, they inherited economies designed to export raw materials to Europe. This pattern continues today. Many African countries are still trapped in a cycle of poverty, partly because of damage done during the slave trade era. Now, let's fast forward to how this history shapes our world today. The racial wealth gap I mentioned earlier affects everything from education to healthcare to housing. Children from families with more wealth can afford better schools, tutoring, and college education. They're more likely to inherit money for a down payment on a house. They have family connections that help them get better jobs. Meanwhile, families without generational wealth face barriers at every step. This isn't just about individual choices, it's about systems that were designed to benefit some people and disadvantage others. The geographic patterns created by slavery also persist today. Many of the poorest regions in the United States are former plantation areas. Cities in the North that profited from the slave trade became centers of wealth and power. The political divisions we see today often follow lines drawn during the slavery era. Cultural impacts are everywhere too. American music, jazz, blues, gospel, hip-hop, all have roots in the experiences of enslaved people and their descendants. The foods we eat, especially in the South, were largely created by enslaved people who adapted African cooking techniques to American ingredients. Even our language contains words and phrases that came from African languages. But perhaps most importantly, the struggle for freedom and equality that began in slave quarters continues today. Every civil rights movement in American history can be traced back to the resistance that started on slave ships and plantations. The Black Lives Matter movement is the latest chapter in a story that began over 400 years ago. Understanding this history helps us make sense of current debates about reparations, criminal justice reform, and systemic racism. These aren't new issues. They're the latest version of conflicts that have been going on since the first slave ship arrived in the Americas. Some people might wonder why we need to keep talking about something that happened so long ago. But here's the thing, it's not ancient history if its effects are still shaping our lives today. When we ignore this history, we make it harder to understand why inequality persists. We miss the connection between past injustices and present problems, and we lose the chance to learn from one of humanity's greatest mistakes. The transatlantic slave trade represents both the worst and best of human nature. It shows how greed and prejudice can create systems of unimaginable cruelty. But it also shows how people can maintain hope, dignity, and resistance, even in the face of absolute oppression. The enslaved people who survived this experience didn't just endure, they created new cultures, fought for freedom, and built communities that continue to thrive today. Their descendants have contributed immeasurably to art, science, sports, politics, and every other aspect of human achievement. This story isn't just about the past, it's about understanding how we got to where we are and where we might go from here. So here we are, 400 years later, still living with the consequences of decisions made by people who saw other human beings as cargo. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just a historical event. It was the foundation that built the modern world. The wealth of nations, the persistence of racism, the global economy, the music you listen to, the food you eat, it all connects back to this story. Understanding this history doesn't mean carrying guilt for things you didn't do. It means recognizing how the past shapes the present, so we can make better choices for the future. If this video changed how you think about history and its impact on today, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear this story, and drop a comment telling me what surprised you most about the connections between slavery and modern society. Thanks for watching.